Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantirme Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, Sarvas Sarvatra Nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om.
We will sing Jaya Vireshwara on page 45. Before we do that, I'll read the translation to you. Jaya Vireshwara, the glorious son of discernment. Jaya Jaya Sri Vivekananda. Thou, filled with pure and beautiful light of divine love, hast realized the truth of the Vedas and Vedanta. Thou, the embodiment of renunciation, endurance, and austerity, hast the pure and tranquil mind. Thou of handsome face and beautiful eyes, art worthy of the adoration of all mankind forever. Thou, bearing the trident of karma, bhakti, and jnana, breakest the bonds of man in delusion. Thou, absorbed in Brahman, grantest the protection of thy lotus feet. Salutations to thee, O Narayana. Thou of handsome face and beautiful eyes, thou absorbed in Brahman, salutations to thee, O Narayana. Thou, the embodiment of renunciation, endurance, and austerity, hast the pure and tranquil mind. Jaya Vireshwara, the glorious son of discernment. Jaya Jaya Sri Vivekananda.
Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Our subject today is the synthesis of yoga. Most Vedanta students recognize that when we use the word yoga, we don't simply mean the exercises and the postures. But primarily, we use the word yoga here in the sense of spiritual discipline. Although we recognize that when we say the word yoga, the first thing that visually comes before the mind are the different postures. That is a small part of one tradition within yoga. So, but it really doesn't stand for the entire. It's a little bit like sometimes some of these little children when they come to go to a temple or come to the Vedanta center, for instance, and especially those who like candy very much. And for at a very young age, going to a Vedanta center would mean that's the place where I get a candy. So we can make that kind of an association. Vedanta society is where the candies are available. But we know that as we grow up, we know that yes, sure, candy is available here, but at Vedanta center there is a lot more that we can have besides candy. So associating yoga immediately only with postures is a little bit like thinking of a temple as simply in terms of candy. So we know that yoga is a much, much more deeper, much, much more profound a tradition. If we go to the root meaning of the word yoga, it's often traced to two different roots in Sanskrit. One root gives the meaning yoga as concentration. And in Patanjali's yoga tradition, the word yoga is primarily used in the sense of concentration. Therefore, one of the earliest sutra would be Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodhaha. Yoga is stilling the waves in the mind. And that's essentially what happens when we are concentrating on any subject. The disturbances in the mind go and the mind gets completely focused. So yoga meaning concentration. But another root of the term yoga gives it a different meaning, and it means joining. Comes closer to the English word to yoke. And the joining we need at least two things. So yoga as a spiritual discipline would mean joining of the creator with his creation. Or in a more theistic language, it would mean the joining of the devotee with the Lord. In a philosophical language, it would mean the joining of the Jivatma, the individual soul, with the Paramatma, with the Supreme Soul. Whichever way we conceive of it, it's some kind of joining. Now, concentration also is a kind of joining, a joining of the mind with whatever it is concentrating on. So the two meanings are related, but they are distinct. So yoga is primarily seen as a form of spiritual discipline. Now, those of us who have a spiritual goal as at least one of the many goals in our lives, those of us who take spiritual life seriously, have some kind of a spiritual discipline or a bunch of things that we do which we see as a part of our spiritual practice. That might include some kind of prayer, some kind of worship, some kind of meditation, some kind of study, some kind of service. There are these different elements in our spiritual life. And sometimes the question comes is, how do all these different elements in my spiritual practice, how do they fit together? Do they fit together? Or is just a bunch of things I'm doing and collectively calling them as my spiritual practice? Or each of the things that I do, which are directly related to my spiritual life, is somehow connected? Is there any order? Can they be synthesized? That's the kind of challenge that most of us have. And that is primarily the focus of the reflection this morning. Traditionally, we know Vedanta tradition is fairly old, so there is a lot of different streams. Just because of its ancientness, there are many different ways the ideal and the ways to reach that ideal have been conceived in the tradition. But primarily, they see as two highways, if you like, or two primary ways of approaching the divine. And in Sanskrit, they are simply called bhakti or jnana, the path of devotion and the path of knowledge. One simple way of understanding the distinction between these two would be to just see how any kind of activity occurs in life. And in spiritual life, for instance, spiritual life generally means seeking after the spirit. The spirit, philosophically it's spirit, sometimes we just use the generic term God, and we have our own specific ways of understanding who or what God is. So there are really at least these two things. There is the supreme being or the ideal, God, and there is me. Again, ways of understanding who I am may be different. The ways of understanding who God is, it may be different. But there are these two poles, the subject and the object. And what connects the subject with the object is really what our spiritual life is, somehow connecting me with the divine. Now, when the primary focus of my attention is the Supreme Being, God, then that is the path of bhakti. Again, it's a very simplistic way of understanding, but it illustrates the two ways of distinguishing between the two. So when the focus is on the objective pole in spiritual life, that is the path of devotion. When the focus is on the subjective pole and the one who is seeking, then that is the path of jnana. And so in the path of bhakti, the discussion centers around who is God? What is the nature of God? How am I related to God? What would God do for me? And so on. And the subjective pole would be, who am I? Who is this I who is trying to seek God? What is the nature of this I? So it's an inquiry into the self and inquiry into the nature of God. Now, because these two are different, because they are focusing on the different poles of this subject-object relationship, there is a clear distinction between the path of jnana and the path of bhakti. And therefore, these were considered as two primary ways of reaching out to the truth. There was never any doubt in these Vedantic thinkers that whichever of these poles you hold on to, ultimately you will be free. So freedom, moksha, was common. They didn't say this only by doing this you would reach it, not by the other way. They were clear. Either way, either you focus on the self or you focus on God, either through the path of devotion or through the path of knowledge, ultimately we will become free from this samsara, bandhana, the bondage of relative existence. Now, the ways of following either of these two, subjective or objective paths, the path of bhakti or jnana, they had what we today understand as yoga. But yoga was primarily understood in the sense of the different kinds of spiritual disciplines. So, for instance, prayer, worship, singing of the Lord's glory, music, all these were considered part of the path of bhakti. the Bhakti Yoga. Similarly, study of scriptures and reflection on meditating on the different scriptural passages. Anything that would involve study and reflection, that was considered a path of Jnana Yoga. And then a path of service, helping others selflessly, that was considered a path of Karma Yoga. So these were the three yogas: Karma, Bhakti, and Jnana. And so if we look at some of these ancient teachers and thinkers in the Vedanta tradition, many of them did speak about synthesizing all these different practices, but the form that synthesis took was what today we might call a vertical synthesis. In other words, they acknowledged the role of all the three yogas in their spiritual life, but the way these yogas were ordered, in what chronology should you follow these different yogas? So let's say in the path of bhakti, in the path of oftentimes a good example in that is the Ramanuja, a great acharya in the Vedanta tradition. So according to him, the first thing that every spiritual seeker will do should follow the path of Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is what purifies our heart. The Sanskrit term for that is Chitta Shuddhi. Chitta is the mind or the heart, and Shuddhi is purification. So the more we serve the needy selflessly, the more the ego goes out, the purer we become. So the first thing necessary is purification of the heart. So when the heart is purified, then according to Ramanuja in the path of bhakti, then you follow a Jnana Yoga. Now, just one clarification. Now, Jnana Yoga is not some kind of a very rigid, it's just a label. So what those on the path of bhakti will understand by Jnana Yoga, and what those on the path of Jnana will understand by Jnana Yoga may not be exactly identical. So the bhakti version of Jnana Yoga, if you like, comes next. And according to Ramanuja, their jnana really would mean knowing oneself as distinct from the body and mind. So the self-knowledge, but a lower self-knowledge, if you like. So that would be that knowledge of the self as distinct from the body and mind. Then finally would be the highest yoga would be the Bhakti Yoga. Once I know I'm distinct from the body and mind, then I have to figure out how this me, who is distinct from the body and mind, how am I related to God? And so that would be the path of Bhakti Yoga. So it goes in this order. First karma, then jnana, then bhakti. And then those in the path of Bhakti Yoga would say that the relationship between the devotee and God could take any of these forms. God is the whole, I am a part of that whole. Or God is the parent, I am a child of God. Or God is the master, I am a servant of God. Whichever way, they didn't lay out any kind of a rigid blueprint. But this was the general pattern. You begin with Karma Yoga, purify your heart, practice Jnana Yoga, know who you are, the Jiva, and then through Bhakti Yoga, discover how this individual self related to God. That was one scheme, a vertical synthesis. You have scope for all the three yogas, one coming after the other. Now, a vertical synthesis was followed also by the people in those who primarily followed the highway of Jnana. Shankaracharya is one good example in that tradition. Now, according to the hymn, similar to the earlier formulation, the first was Karma Yoga, again, purification of the heart. The second was Bhakti Yoga. And Bhakti Yoga was what would then focus all of my faculties, all of my body, mind, everything towards that ultimate reality. And finally would be the Jnana Yoga, where one looks deeply within the self and discovers that the individual self and the supreme self are not really two. So there was synthesis, a vertical synthesis, karma, bhakti, jnana, or karma, jnana, bhakti. So this was one way in ancient times they tried to synthesize the different yogas. Now, oftentimes, many of us also tend to identify certain practices and classify them under certain yogas. So most of us almost instinctively say, well, prayer and worship, well, of course that's a path of devotion. Scriptural study, of course that's a path of Jnana Yoga, and so on. And so because we associate certain practices with certain yogas, what many of us who want to combine all of these yogas as a part of our spiritual discipline end up doing what may be called a horizontal synthesis. That is, we do a little bit of each in the course of a day or in the course of our life. So we recognize the importance of all of these yogas, and we say, well, I would like to not become one-sided. I would like to have scope. I would like to include all of these practices within my spiritual discipline. And so let me do a little bit of prayer every day, a little bit of worship, a little bit of service. Let me study something every day. And so this is kind of a horizontal synthesis, doing a little bit of everything. And so all the yogas kind of get included. So we've seen a vertical synthesis and a horizontal synthesis. Now, what Swami Vivekananda did was well, he did quite a number of things about yoga specifically. So traditionally I said there were only these three yogas, karma, bhakti, and jnana. Now what's in Swami Vivekananda's formulation of yogas, we find there are four. So first of all, one yoga gets added and called it the Raja Yoga. Now the terms Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga are not the terms invented by Swamiji. Those terms existed before. But what he did was to define those terms in a unique way, you could say. In a unique because we don't find any reference to the way Swamiji defined them before Swamiji. So in some sense, the way the four yogas are formulated today is a original contribution that Swami Vivekananda made to the philosophical thought of India. And what he did was this: how did he narrow down this vast yogic tradition into these four categories? And if we see Swamiji's writings on the subject, it becomes clear that he, instead of associating specific practices with specific yoga, what he did was he actually turned the whole thing topsy-turvy, if you like. Now, he said, no matter which yoga we practice, the primary instruments that we use for that are the body and mind. Well, we don't have anything else. No matter what we do, there is the body and there is the mind. And mind, I'm using it in a collective sense, including intellect and ego and all of that. So what Swamiji did was this, that since mind is a common factor, no matter which spiritual practice we adopt, he took a closer look at the mind itself. And we know that the functions of the mind are broadly three. One function of the mind is cognitive, grasping, understanding things. And that is what we generally call the intellect, buddhi in Sanskrit. So the cognitive function of the mind, so there are certain practices which predominantly use the cognitive function of the mind. The second function of the mind is affective, that is, which uses the power of emotions and feelings. So what Swamiji did was that, well, there are a lot of spiritual practices which predominantly use the power of emotions, the power of feelings. And a third function of the mind is called the cognitive. Cognitive is what we might say the power of the will. So there are certain spiritual practices which predominantly use the willpower within us. So those spiritual practices which predominantly use the cognitive function, the function of the intellect, he said all of those practices will come under the general category called Jnana Yoga. All of the practices which predominantly use the affective function, the power of emotions and feelings, would come under the path of devotion, bhakti. All the practices which use the power of the willpower, as it functions in the external world, through the work that we do, through our relationships with others. So willpower, as it is employed in the external world, he called it the karma yoga, the path of selfless action. And willpower used in the internal world to control and purify the parts of the mind, he called it Raja Yoga. So the four yogas are not really referring to some specific spiritual practices, but the four yogas specifically refer to the three functions of the mind, and whether a practice belongs to this yoga or that yoga will be determined by which function of the mind is predominantly used in that practice. Now, for analysis, it's kind of easy to say emotions, intellect, and willpower, but there is no, I mean, the mind is not compartmentalized that way. So there is no practice which we can say this uses only emotions and feelings, as if there is no scope for intellect there, or there is no willpower use. It's never like that. That's why I use the phrase predominantly. So there are certain practices which we may need willpower, which will need emotions and feeling, but which predominantly uses the intellect. And there are other practices which may have the use of intellect, which may have the use of willpower, which predominantly uses emotions and feeling. So the word predominantly is very important. So the four yogas of Swamiji, the way he divided them, is based on the functions of the mind. When yoga is understood in this sense, then several things come up. How are these four yogas understood in this sense related to one another? And one observation straight away is that they are not mutually contradictory. So it's not as if I practice one yoga, it's going to come in conflict with another yoga. Essentially, they are just different functions of the mind that are being used. A second thing is, each of these yogas has the power inherent in it to take us to that highest goal. If my goal is God realization or self-knowledge, any of these yogas can take me to that highest goal. So this vertical synthesis and horizontal synthesis, which might give us the idea that I have to practice all these yogas in some form, Swamiji said it's not theoretically necessary. I can hold on to just one yoga and it can give me the highest. Having said that, Swami Vivekananda also pointed out that it's probably not a good idea to just hold on to one. It's a little bit like if someone is, say, doing a portrait, painting a portrait, you would want that the artist would pay equal attention to every feature on the face, the eyes, the nose, the ears, and so on. What if the artist said, I'm only interested in noses? So I'm just going to focus on the nose, and other things I really don't care. It's not really going to look good. Now, that's a kind of very crude example, but that's the idea, that while maybe one of these four yogas may resonate with us more than the others, it will helpful to find a place for all of these yogas in our life. In a rare case, we might say all the three functions of the mind may be equally developed in a person. And such a person would say, I love all of the yogas equally. And a lot of us may say that, but that may not always be true. It's a little bit like, depending on whichever is the hand we tend to use while writing or doing most of the activities, very few people can do all activities equally with both hands. One of the two would be like dominant. Similarly, while we have two hands, one hand tends to do more things than the other. So similarly, while all of us have a mind, and all the minds have these three functions, oftentimes one or the other of these functions in our mind may be more dominant. But that doesn't mean the other functions are absent. So oftentimes, whichever is the dominant function of the mind, we might gravitate towards that yoga which uses that function. We do sometimes characterize people and say, oh, that person is very emotional, or that person is very rational. So when we say someone is emotional, I hope we don't mean that that person has no intellect at all or no willpower at all. It just means that the emotional side of that person is more dominant than the others. So depending on whichever of these functions is dominant, many of us might have discovered that when we read these four yogas of Swami Vivekananda, we might somehow have a soft corner for one yoga more than the other. And that's okay, that's natural. And that might form the dominant part of our spiritual practice. But it is helpful to find some scope, some place for even these other yogas which may not attract us so much. And the reason for this is simple. The reason is this. While, let's say, the path of knowledge, while Jnana Yoga is a complete path in itself, it can take me to that highest goal, even if I totally ignore all the yogas. The condition for that is I must follow that yoga perfectly. And that's a big condition. Because if I don't follow it perfectly, if I do it in less than perfect way, if I do it haphazardly, then there are some real dangers. And one major danger would be that because I'm predominantly using my intellect, intellectual understanding can often get mistaken for spiritual experience. Just because something is very clear to me in my head, I might begin to think, well, that means, oh, I know Atman and Brahman is one. I know everything is one. Okay, but where do I know it? It's just very intellectual. But if I don't have place in my life for the other yogas, that kind of intellectual understanding itself may make me think I have already realized just because I have understood it. Sometimes the life itself can become just endless debates, endless and over-intellectualization of stuff. So scholarship can get mistaken for spirituality. And so to avoid that danger, if there is a scope for bhakti or devotion in life, then it will keep this ego of knowledge, if you like, they make this person a little bit humble. So it just kind of lubricates the rough edges of this path if I don't follow it perfectly. Same danger can exist in the other yogas as well. If I say, I'm just going to follow bhakti, I just don't care for anything else, fine. If I do it perfectly, great. What if I'm not able to do it perfectly? So oftentimes, if I'm not able to do it perfectly, then emotions and feeling, my spiritual life should not get reduced to simply some kind of a sentimentalism. Just being very emotional about something may make me feel, oh, that's now this great bhakti, a high bhakti has entered into my heart. Now, simply being emotional about something doesn't necessarily, emotional and devotional are two different things. And so, for someone on the path of bhakti, devotion, a little bit of practice of knowledge, even if it is subsidiary, kind of helps to keep it balanced. Swami Vivekananda gives the example in his writings about a bird flying. And he says, just as the knowledge and devotion are two wings, and the path of karma and Raj Yoga are the tail which kind of navigates the flight of the bird's path in a perfect way. In other words, it's helpful to have all of these, find a place for all of these in our life. So the kind of synthesis that Swami Vivekananda encouraged was neither a vertical synthesis nor a horizontal synthesis, but what one might call a holistic synthesis. In other words, using every function of the mind in a way that will, as an instrument that will take me to that highest goal. And I might conceive of that goal in whichever way that it comes naturally to me. But using, we have the willpower. Am I able to use my willpower in a way that will take me closer to my spiritual ideal? Am I able to use the power of my emotions in a way that will take me closer to my spiritual ideal? Am I able to use the power of my thinking, the power of my intellect, in a way it will take me closer to my spiritual ideal? So looking upon yoga as primarily the functioning of the different parts of the mind is very helpful. So prayer. Now prayer is not automatically a path of devotion. Yes, of course. Prayer done with a lot of feeling and emotions, we might say, is a path of bhakti. But there are people who over-intellectualize the practice of prayer also. It's like, who listens? Who is listening to my prayers? What exactly happens when I pray? If that's the attitude with which I pray, I really am using my intellect more than my feelings. So even that kind of prayer would strictly belong to Jnana Yoga, if you like. So I mention this to show that characterizing a particular practice as belonging to this or that yoga is probably not a good idea. But seeing which part of my mind, which function of my mind I'm predominantly using in that practice. So this method of using all the faculties of our mind consciously and making sure that they take me towards my goal and not away from my goal, that would be the best form of synthesis that we can do. Swami Vivekananda gives one very helpful tip about how to develop harmoniously in our lives. And he says that while I am engaged in a certain practice, I should not at that time think about anything else. Now, let me give an example. So, let's say it's time for prayer, and then afterwards I'm going to do some scriptural study. So rather than when I'm praying, thinking that, oh, this is the part of my practice, and the other part will come later when I study, Swamiji said that's probably not a good idea. So, whichever practice I'm doing, consider that practice as complete in itself. In other words, when I pray, I should think this is all that there is. Don't think about the study you're going to do. Don't think about the service activities you are engaged in. Don't think about anything. Don't think about meditation. Don't think about anything other than that. Just be fully engaged in that act of prayer. And once that prayer is over, and then now say it's time for you to study. So when you're studying, then put your whole mind into that study, and then convince yourself that that deep study itself will make you free. So in short, whatever it is that I'm engaged in, I must think that that is the only thing that will make me free. And this helps even when one of the difficulties many of us have, especially in the initial stages of our practice, is about getting distracted. The mind wandering during meditation. The mind wandering even when we are doing japa. There are many verses and songs from different saints and mystics describing that while you may use a rosary, japamala to do your japa, that this may become moving mechanically, but the mind may be going in its own direction, and then that doesn't help. So one way that is very helpful is, let's say when you're doing japa, if we can convince ourselves that remembering of the Lord, repeating your mantra, that is the most important thing to you at that time. Nothing else in life is more important. And not doing it with attention is like death. Now you need, we spoke some weeks ago about creative imagination. You need that kind of creative imagination. Think about it this way. If you are now walking along, let's say you have to cross a bridge, and that bridge is very narrow, and it's kind of broken. And so you have to put every step very carefully. One wrong step and you fall down to the deepest valley and you are dead. So if that's a situation we find ourselves in, I hope we don't, but if we find ourselves in that kind of situation, I guarantee you, no one is going to say, oh, my mind is getting distracted. No, it will not happen, because you know that one wrong step and you are dead, you're gone. So the mind will automatically be focused there, because you know the consequences of doing it in a distracted way would mean death. Now the problem with meditation is that people find, I can sit for meditation, my mind can wander here and there, nothing happens, I'm not dead. And so we don't realize the seriousness of that situation. But in fact, as far as our spiritual life is concerned, that's not any less than a grave injury or even death. As they say, clock is ticking. We may not always hear that ticking, but it is ticking nonetheless. Sri Ramakrishna speaks about vyakulata, longing. That intense longing can come only if I realize the seriousness of the situation. Sri Ramakrishna gives the example of a student who used to go and ask her teacher, saying, oh, when I've been practicing for such a long time, still no realization. When will I realize God? And the teacher one day took that student and they said, let's go to the river. And they should go and bathe in the river. So they go to the river, and then when the teacher and the student and the river, the teacher simply holds that student and holds him under the water. And the two students like, what happened? My teacher is trying to kill me. But anyway, for a long time, the student is struggling, and the teacher holds him underwater. And then after some time, of course, he doesn't kill him. He releases him, and the student suddenly comes up. And then the teacher said, when I had held you under that water, what were you thinking of? And that time he said, all that I was thinking of, how will I be free? And when will I be able to breathe? Because otherwise I'm dead. So the teacher then tells him, that intensity with which you wanted that fresh air, to breathe that air, when you have that kind of intensity, then you will realize God. So oftentimes when we wonder whether we are making any spiritual progress in life, we have to ask ourselves, what is the level of my intensity? Because if I have that kind of intensity, we'll be able to hear the clock tick. We will realize then, every moment, my life is becoming shorter by one moment. And we don't even know how much shorter it has become because we don't know where the end point is. At least if we knew, think about it this way. Now people speak about budgeting, that I must, if you know how much income you have, how much money you have, then you can decide how much you would like to spend for what things in life. And that's clearly a wise thing to do. But what if the bank tells you, I'm not going to tell you how much money you have. No one tells you how much money you have. And yet you're going to need money to spend. Now, if I don't know how much I have, I will try to be very careful with what I spend because I don't know how much I have. But that's our situation. We don't know how many moments in life are there ahead of us. And so every moment that is spent or that is wasted is a moment that is gone. And next is I'm just going to fall into that valley. Now, every one of us doesn't feel that way. Most of us don't feel that way. Which is why then we don't seem to make as much progress as we would like. But if I want to actually experience that progress, then I must see the intensity, how much intensity I have and how much careful I am in using the time that is at my disposal. Then when you sit for meditation, sit to do your japa, then you know every repetition that my mind is distracted is a moment that is wasted, is a moment that I have gone closer to death without having gone closer to God. So I'll just conclude by saying that there is, and I've mentioned this several times before, that while death is always an unpleasant topic, what I'm recommending is not some kind of a neurotic obsession with death. That doesn't help, that's bad, that's weakening, that's terrible. But a healthy, positive way of understanding life. If I can understand childhood, teenage years, middle years, and age, then I must make an effort to say, well, just as these are different stages in life, death is one stage in life. And the more I'm able to look at that in a constructive way, in a positive way, I will be able to make use of the resources available to me in as best a way as possible. And one resource that is available to everyone is time, except that we don't know how much time. One thing we do know, that every one of us, young or old, rich or poor, irrespective of which political party you belong to, we all have only 24 hours in a day. How we want to use those 24 hours is up to us. There is not one moment extra, not one moment less. Time is very democratic in that way. Everyone gets the same amount of time in a day. And as spiritual seekers, if we can find a way of synthesizing all the different aspects of our spiritual life into one wholesome practice, then there is a chance that we will realize God before our time is up. A spiritual life is an undivided life. It's not about compartmentalizing. It's not about saying, oh, this is my spiritual life, this is my secular life. Those kind of compartments has to go. I'm either a worldly person or I'm a spiritual person. An authentic spiritual life would mean I'm as much spiritual inside a temple as when I'm at my workplace. Even when I'm marketing, even when I am going for a party, I am still a spiritual person going to a party. I am still a spiritual person who is marketing. And if I'm a worldly person, even when I go to a temple to pray, I will do it in a very worldly way. So, authenticity is important. In some sense, probably worldly people are more authentic than spiritual people, because authentically worldly people are worldly everywhere. But I have to be an authentically spiritual person. So I cannot say I'm spiritual in one place and then secular in another place. So synthesis of yoga, we must find a way of synthesizing the different elements of our spiritual life. And so today, very briefly, I showed you how it was done in ancient times, how they had this scheme of vertical synthesis, how many of us try to have this horizontal synthesis. But rather than making our spiritual life a kind of hodgepodge of many different elements got from many different traditions, and somehow hoping that it will ultimately all work out, it's better to have a more systematized way of going forward. After all, it's our life, and we must make the best of the opportunities that are available to us. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. Next Sunday, we'll celebrate the Guru Purnima, the annual festival that we have. This is said to be, in the Vedanta tradition, the birthday of Vyasa, the great teacher. And that's the day it's called Guru Purnima, because then that day, it's a day of remembering our own teacher. So irrespective of whichever tradition we belong to, irrespective of whichever teacher has been who has instructed us in spiritual life, that is one day we all come together, we remember our teachers and the lineage to which we belong. So that's a way of honoring our own teacher and honoring all the teachers of the past, all the teachers of the present, and all the teachers that are yet to come. So it's a day dedicated to the Guru. So we will have that next Sunday. As we do every year, we'll have a short worship. There'll be music, there'll be prayer, there'll be meditation, there'll be a short reflection on the Guru, and then there will be potluck lunch. So bring your best dishes. At some point, I think, not this time, but it might be good to have a kind of a competition and have a few judges to say the most, then maybe we might get some more variety, and we'll see. Not this time. Not this time. So that's what we will do on Sunday. On Tuesday and Saturday, we'll have the Arati and meditation as usual. And on Wednesday, we will continue with the study of the Kaivalya Upanishad. Let's conclude with a prayer now on page 3. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all. and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.